Okay, this concludes the discussion of equality per se, as it were. And now we're going to be discussing discrimination. I hope you can see that the topic is not far behind, as it were. Because obviously, one way of understanding discrimination, or one thread of ways of understanding discrimination, is via the thought of a violation of equality. So discrimination is a more specific, equality-related kind of topic. Now, discrimination comes up often in the political sphere, or perhaps in semi-political spheres, like say in grading. But it may come up more broadly than this, and we're not going to discuss it for the most part. I do want to mention some of these cases just to see that the topics are interesting and that a fuller discussion of discrimination will have to take them into account as well. For instance, what do we think about discrimination when it comes to party invitations? What if I invite all the people to my party, all the people who live on my block, except for the Jews or except for the blacks? That does seem to be wrong, and more than that, it seems to be discriminatory. It seems to be wrong in the typical way in which discrimination is wrong. Now, that does not mean that we should call in the Marines, right? It doesn't seem to be the kind of thing that the law deals with, nor does it seem the kind of thing that the law should deal with, discrimination in party invitations. But a fuller philosophical account of what discrimination is, of what its typical wrongness comes to, and perhaps which responses it calls for, is going to have to discuss these things as well. Here's another, perhaps even more interesting, even more problematic kind of case. What can we say about discrimination in intimate relationships? What if I'm just not okay in befriending the Jews or the blacks or the Arabs? What if it's even more intimate than that? We do not tend to scrutinize, at least not often, people's tendencies in who they are attracted to, say sexually or otherwise. But discriminatory patterns may be relevant there as well, and perhaps the kind of wrongness that's a part of the idea of discrimination too. So there's much more to say about other non-political cases of discrimination. And again, a full discussion of discrimination may have to include them. It may have, indeed, it may include some lessons learned from the non-political cases and then applied in the political cases as well. But we're not going to discuss them further here. We're going to be discussing mostly the kind of paradigmatic case. And when we're talking about the paradigmatic case of discrimination, you know what kind of case I'm talking about, and it seems obviously wrong, and also the kind of thing that should be and that often is illegal, right? So if the state prevents access to certain kinds of opportunities from people based on gender, based on race, based on nationality, based on perhaps sexual orientation, or some other things along these lines, then they are paradigmatic cases of discrimination. And even before doing the philosophical work, they are clearly wrong and should be illegal in any decent society. So you may think that that was a really quick way of ending the discussion of discrimination, but it's too quick, as you may suspect. And there are at least two reasons for that. One is that there are going to be many unobvious cases. We're going to mention some of them later on. So from the fact that there are obvious cases of discrimination where it's clear that they're wrong, it's roughly clear why, and it's clear that they should be illegal, there are going to be many cases in which we're just not quite sure what to say. And so a theory is called for. And the other point is, even for the obvious cases, even if in the obvious cases it's obvious that they're wrong, it's still not as obvious exactly why. And we're going to have to discuss some unobvious cases in order to sort of distinguish between different possible answers to the question, why is discrimination wrong, when it is wrong. Okay, a major part of the discussion in the literature on discrimination is about what discrimination is. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, that does not turn out to be simple at all. It's just not clear how to answer this question. Some people discussing discrimination address this question as if it's a matter of definition, as if the main thing we want is to define discrimination. But as I hope you already know by now, I don't think that definitions are that interesting or important philosophically at all. They may be important legally. We'll get back to that. But philosophically speaking, it's never about a definition of a word. It's not about how you say it. It's about what you say. So there must be a substantive, not a terminological issue that makes the discussion of what discrimination is interesting. I think that issue is roughly what's the distinctive wrong that's involved in cases of discrimination, if indeed there is one at all? Perhaps the thought then is that cases of discrimination involve a characteristic kind of wrong. They're not just wrong, but all cases of discrimination are wrong in roughly the same kind of way. And we're trying to find that. We're trying to find or to focus attention on the characteristic wrong of discrimination. And then you can maybe define discrimination in terms of it or not. No one cares how you use the word. What we care about is this characteristic wrong. So philosophically, as I said, I don't think it matters how we define the term. We should also keep an open mind about the possibility that perhaps discrimination in itself is not that philosophically interesting. Perhaps, for instance, it does not form a normative kind. So when philosophers talk of kinds, they talk of things that have, say, some important, perhaps even essential, shared properties, right? So for instance, water seems to be a natural kind because it matters whether some liquid is water or not, and that helps to explain all sorts of things like in what temperature it freezes, things like that. So we can talk about normative kinds as well. And if you think that there's a characteristic wrong, perhaps ideally, that's shared by all and only cases of discrimination, then you think that discrimination forms a normative kind, and then it's philosophically interesting. But it's possible that that's just not the case. It's possible that there are different cases of discrimination, that some of them are wrong and some not. And of those who are wrong, not all are wrong for the very same reason and in the very same way and to the same extent. And perhaps there are other things that are not discriminations that are wrong in those ways as well, and so on. If that's the case, then we'll have to conclude that discrimination does not constitute a normative kind and is not an interesting, independent category to discuss philosophically. Here's a kind of a suspicion in that direction. Suppose we know that an action is wrong, and suppose furthermore we know why it is wrong, but suppose it's still not clear to us whether it's discriminatory or not. At this point, at least if we're doing philosophy rather than law, which we'll get to in a second, it seems very tempting that the thing to say is, well, I don't care whether it's discrimination or not. I've just told you everything you need to know. I've told you that it's wrong and I've told you why. Why do you care whether you can also put it in the drawer, as it were, of discrimination? So philosophically, it's not clear that definitions matter in general or here. But legally, they may matter, at least once we have, as indeed we do in most jurisdictions, a fairly elaborate, fairly developed body of anti-discrimination law. Once you have anti-discrimination law, obviously it applies to cases of discrimination, at least as the law uses this term. And then it's really important what does not satisfy the term discrimination, because it's really important how far do the defenses of anti-discrimination law reach. That's an important discussion to have. At least a part of it, maybe all of it, is going to be couched in terms of policy considerations. So you're going to have to ask about what the world will look like if we allow the defenses of anti-discrimination law to apply to this case as well. How is this going to influence, say, people's incentives or other important consequences? So we're not going to be discussing these. This is all I'm going to say about it. The questions about how far we want the defenses offered by anti-discrimination law to reach, how this is going to be determined, at least to a large extent, by policy considerations of the kind mentioned. But we're not going to get into them anymore. Okay, then, now we're going to try and understand what discrimination comes to. Once again, the question is of interest not from the point of view of offering a definition of discrimination, but primarily from the point of view of trying to characterize a characteristic wrong of discrimination, if there is one at all. And so one natural suggestion here, and one that flows nicely from the first half of the class today, is the thought that perhaps what's going on in cases of discrimination is that like cases are not treated alike. Perhaps that's the crucial wrongness of discrimination. Now this may be a good start, but at this point we already know that it's not going to be easy to fill in the details here. In particular, it's not going to be easy to fill in the details about what it takes for two cases to be alike. Clearly, it doesn't seem like any case of failing to treat like cases alike amounts to a case of discrimination in the intended sense. So here's a silly example. Suppose I'm grading papers. Suppose they're two equally good papers, and I'm complimenting both the papers or the writers, but I'm using slightly different words, just different formulations of my compliments. Does this violate the norm of treating like cases alike? Am I discriminating between the two students because I use somewhat different words while complimenting them and grading them equally? That seems unacceptable. Perhaps what's needed here is the thought that it's not just that you're not treating them alike, you're using somewhat different words and complimenting them. The important thing is whether you're treating them in not alike, but in a way that disadvantages one of them. The thing that makes the silly example is that they don't care in what words exactly I use to compliment them, right? No one is disadvantaged by that. So even if I don't thereby treat these like cases exactly alike, I treat them alike in the important sense. What makes the sense important is that no one is disadvantaged. Okay, so let's talk about disadvantage. And here it is again a natural thought, because it does apply to at least the paradigmatic cases of wrong discrimination. In those cases, those discriminated against suffer a disadvantage, perhaps as a constitutive part of the discrimination, or perhaps as a consequence, as a result of being discriminated against. So you may think that disadvantage, because it's so central for the paradigmatic cases, is a necessary and maybe also sufficient condition for discrimination. But it's important to see that this is not so. The first point is, of course, to see that nothing about disadvantage is sufficient for discrimination. We may treat people in ways that disadvantage them, but they don't do it compared to other people, and so that are not discriminatory. You can harm people in many ways, and that's going to be a problem for how you treat them, but that's not going to be discrimination. And in the opposite direction, there may be many cases of legitimate disadvantage. So you may think that even though you disadvantage someone by, say, opening a competing business right across the street from theirs, you do disadvantage them, but that is not even wronging them, let alone discriminating against them. So it seems clear that disadvantage is not a sufficient condition for discrimination. But there's more. You may think that if there is disadvantage in a specific kind of discrimination, the only thing needed in order to explain the wrongness is the disadvantaging itself. You don't also have to invoke norms of discrimination. In fact, they seem at this point redundant. You've already explained what's wrong. What's wrong is that you've disadvantaged someone in circumstances in which that's unjustifiable. So it seems like discrimination somehow drops out of the normative picture here. And that also pulls in the direction of thinking that disadvantage is not the main thing about discrimination at all. As if all of this is not enough, there are also really interesting cases that show that disadvantage does not seem to be necessary for discrimination either. So here's a case from Deborah Hellman's book. She discusses the case in the context of an account of discrimination, but the case comes from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, where he describes, at least at some point in prison, there was a distinction in the uniform for whites and blacks in apartheid South Africa. And the distinction was that the blacks were required to wear short pants rather than long pants as the whites did. And it's clear what the point was. It's about infantilizing the blacks compared to the whites or something along these lines. But also, importantly, South Africa's climate is quite warm. So it may very well have been more comfortable to wear the short pants rather than long ones. In that sense, at least, the blacks were not disadvantaged by these differential uniform rules. But it still seems very clear that these rules were discriminatory and that the blacks were discriminated against. If so, this is a strong example, a strong counterexample to the thought that disadvantage is necessary for discrimination. We do not have disadvantage here, but we do have discrimination here. Here's another kind of case. There actually was a recent Israeli case that went through the courts. And that was about insurance. And some insurance company offered a kind of special deal on roadside assistance for women. So, I don't know, better prices for women than for men on this extra feature of roadside assistance insurance. The court ruled that these offers were discriminatory. Whom did they disadvantage, though? So you may think that they disadvantaged men, and the court did think that these rules were discriminatory against men. But interestingly, the court thought that these rules were also discriminatory against women, even though women were not disadvantaged by them at all. You can sort of see the point, right? The point is about what message it expresses about the competence of women, or something along these lines. So this may also be, I'm not entirely sure about this case, but to the extent that you agree with the court, then this is another case that shows nicely that disadvantage is not a necessary condition for discrimination. You may want to sort of play a little bit with the relevant notion of disadvantage. You may think that blacks in South Africa apartheid prisons were, in fact, disadvantaged by the short pants rules. Although they were made more comfortable, they were disadvantaged in some other, perhaps somewhat more abstract way. Perhaps similarly for women regarding cheaper roadside assistance insurance. But I'm not sure that's going to help, because when you try to specify the more abstract notion of disadvantage, you may have to rely on the fact that they're being treated unjustly because discriminated against. And while that may be true, it renders your explanation void, because it's circular, right? Now you're saying it's discriminatory partly because disadvantage, and there is disadvantage partly because discriminatory. And that's not an acceptable pattern of explanation. So disadvantage, while obviously important in the background here, is neither necessary nor sufficient, and it's not clear how exactly it's related to the wrongness of discrimination. Here's another natural suggestion, and it's in terms of irrationality. So it seems very clear that some factors are relevant for some decisions, and some factors are not. And it's rational to draw distinctions based on these factors, the relevant ones, but not on the others. So for instance, if you're admitting people to med school, some considerations are relevant. It's actually quite tricky to think which ones are, right? But I don't know, intelligence, the ability to persevere, I guess for some things like hand-eye coordination, I don't know, things like that. They seem to be at least good candidates for being relevant. And so distinguishing based on those factors seems rational. They are factors that are relevant for the distinction. It's rational to rely on them. But there are also many other factors that are just not relevant at all. So it's just not relevant what the race of the candidate is, or the gender, or the sexual orientation. So if you rely on these distinctions, you're being irrational. You're making decisions that are clearly irrational. They're based on factors that are irrelevant to the decision that has to be made. And I do think that in typical cases of discrimination, a major part of the problem is that the discrimination is irrational. So if you're admitting people to med school based on their race or on their gender, among other things, you're being irrational. That seems right. So once again, it seems tempting to think that a full account of the wrongness or the characteristic wrongness of discrimination is going to be in terms of irrationality. Once again, then I want to resist this temptation. First thing to see here is that irrationality is not sufficient for the wrongness of discrimination. This is because there are many ways of making rationally poor decisions that just do not amount to discrimination at all. We are irrational, we're suddenly less than ideally rational all the time for any numbers of reasons, in any numbers of ways, without being also discriminatory in the process. Some of these ways of being irrational are not even wrong. But some of them may be wrong, but not wrong in the discriminatory kind of way. So it doesn't seem like irrationality suffices for discrimination. Also, it's not at all clear, and this is sort of a more painful and important point, it's not at all clear that irrationality is necessary for discrimination at all. In other words, there are cases of rational discrimination. These are cases of morally objectionable, politically objectionable, perhaps illegal discrimination that rely on rational distinctions. Here are two examples. So the topic of racial profiling is, of course, extremely important in this context. And there are many ways of doing racial profiling, and many of them are wrong for more than one reason. But here's the painful case. The painful case is the case in which racial profiling works. Namely, it relies on sound statistical evidence that say most terrorists come from a specific kind of group or something like this. And then it's very efficient in, say, preventing terrorist attacks at a very small cost to anyone whose likelihood of being a terrorist is negligible. Something along these lines. Many people think that such cases of racial profiling are still discriminatory. They're still wrong, at least pro tanto, and furthermore wrong in a kind of way in which paradigmatic cases of discrimination are wrong. But it would be wrong to say that they are irrational. In the same sense, it would be irrational to admit people to med school based on race, because these are statistically relevant considerations that you're relying on. So if you agree that such cases of racial profiling are still wrong because discriminatory, this is a counterexample to the thought that irrationality is a necessary condition for discrimination. Here's another kind of painful case. So think about perhaps a shop owner who is not a racist at all, but still insists on hiring only white employees. And the reason that he's giving for that is that although he is not racist at all, his customers are. So if he hires a black person, which is fine by him, less people are going to come into the store. So his main motivation here is about maximizing profits. And that's an entirely legitimate kind of motivation when you own a business. It's perhaps the overarching one. You can't say that his decision is irrational. It's based on a relevant distinction, namely which one will maximize profits for the business. Still, it seems wrong, and it seems discriminatory. It seems wrong in the kind of way discrimination is typically wrong. If that's so, that's another counterexample to the thought that irrationality is necessary for wrong discrimination. I want to mention in this context also it's a really wide, extremely important, very, very complicated kind of case. And that's the case of insurance. So I already said something about roadside assistance insurance, but we can talk about insurance in much wider kind of way. The question, which distinctions should insurers be allowed to take into account and which it would be discriminatory for them to take into account, these questions are extremely important. There's a lot of money in it. But also they're really intricate theoretically and philosophically, and more work needs to be done on them. Because relying on statistical evidence is precisely what insurance companies do. That's what they're supposed to do. And then they can draw distinctions in all sorts of ways. Some of them will seem more problematic to us, some of them less. Much more to be said here. Okay, here's another attempt at an account of a characteristic wrong of discrimination. This again comes from Deborah Hellman, whose picture is right there. The intuitive idea is that what's really problematic about cases of discrimination, about wrong cases of discrimination, is not about disadvantage exactly, and not about irrationality. It's about sending a demeaning message. So there's a strong expressive part to the problematic nature of discrimination. Notice that on this kind of account, you get immediately what on other accounts you may get more indirectly, namely the relevance of salient groups. So groups that have traditionally been discriminated against in a certain society. We think of other distinctions in terms of those social groups as at least suspicious. If I come from a country in which, say, Arabs are routinely discriminated against, and if an insurance company offers a kind of differential policies to Arabs, then we are immediately suspicious. Maybe at the end of the day it can somehow be vindicated, but it's immediately suspicious. Not so if they offered a different kind of insurance for, I don't know, tall people. But that's because tall people are not a salient group. They're not a group with a tradition, with a strong history of being discriminated against. So it does seem like whether a distinction is along the lines of a kind of socially, historically salient group matters. And according to Hellman's theory of, Hellman's expressivist theory of the wrongness of discrimination, you can see why. The point is that a distinction between, say, Afro-Americans and Caucasians in the States will be a distinction that's extremely suspicious of sending a demeaning message. A distinction between taller and less tall people, not so much. This also nicely explains how the direction matters here. This is the point that many people find perplexing sometimes. So here's an example. So in philosophy, I'm sad to say, women are still rather seriously underrepresented. And there's a lot of talk You can check out some of the relevant websites. A lot of talk on how to change this. Apparently a good idea is to perhaps create reading groups in philosophy for just women philosophers and women students. And that does not seem to me to be wrong or discriminatory in any way. In fact, as chair of department, I did encourage such groups. But I would never encourage such groups for men only. And that does seem to me to be wrong, and indeed wrong in the kind of way in which discrimination is often wrong. So now you may wonder why. There's a kind of a weird asymmetry. But Hellman's theory gives us the resources to answer this question. The problem is that, at least given the general social salience of the gender distinction, which is not symmetrical, and indeed the relevant distinction within the trade of philosophy, because women are underrepresented, not men, then if we have a group that's only for men philosophers, that sends a demeaning message. Perhaps it indicates that we don't think women are as good as men are in doing philosophy. But the other way around, if we have a group just for women, it does not send a demeaning message. Of course, in circumstances in which it would be discriminatory and wrong, because that's the characteristic wrong of discrimination, sending the demeaning message. Notice also how this gets nicely some of the cases we mentioned earlier. The problem with the Mandela case, according to Hellman, was not about comfort in the sun. The problem was about sending a demeaning message. And clearly, the differential uniform code in apartheid South Africa was all about sending a demeaning message. Perhaps, although not as clearly, similarly for the roadside assistance case from the Israeli court. So I do think that the story here in terms of sending a demeaning message does go a long way towards an account of the wrong of discrimination. But I want to raise some doubts about that too. And the first thing to note is that it's not clear that sending a demeaning message is at all necessary for cases of discrimination. There may be cases of discrimination that just do not send a demeaning message at all. Now that's going to be hard to determine before we have a full account of what it is for a message to be demeaning. Hellman says more about it in her book. We're not going to get into all of the details. But here's one possible question. Is it a necessary condition for a message to be demeaning that it's understood as demeaning by the relevant audience, that there is uptake, as it were? If so, then whether a message is demeaning, and so whether an action is discriminatory, may depend on the subjective responses of the audience members. And that seems a little odd. It seems like we should hope for at least a somewhat more objective account of discrimination and the relevant wrongness. Perhaps what we want is a kind of more objective understanding of sending a demeaning message. Perhaps what's important is not the responses of the audience, but perhaps the responses that are merited or that the audience would have had the audience responded as they should or as they are expected, something along these lines. Again, more details are to be found in Hellman's interesting book. Another problem about the sending a demeaning message account of discrimination is that it's not clear it gives us a full account of the wrongness of discrimination. After all, we don't in general think that sending demeaning messages should be illegal. We don't have a general rule along these lines. So you may say, no, discrimination is wrong because it sends in a demeaning message in a specifically important kind of way that, say, calls for illegality. But then to an extent, we're back at square one, because now I want to know what's the specific, really important kind of way in which discrimination sends a demeaning message so that rendering it illegal is justified. And you still need an account of what's special about the wrongness of discrimination. So in that sense, not much progress has been made. Also, it seems clear that sending a demeaning message is not sufficient for discrimination. I suspect we do send demeaning messages all the time in all sorts of non-discriminatory ways. So once again, more details are needed for this account to be a plausible account, a plausible general account of the wrongness of discrimination. Okay, so where are we at right now? Well, I told you it wasn't going to be easy to offer an account of discrimination or its distinct wrongness. Now, these were just a few attempts at answers from the literature. They weren't randomly picked. They are, I think, it's safe to say, the most influential ones out there. But it's possible that there are others. Maybe we should just work a little harder on it. Another possibility, though, is that perhaps there's just not much more to say in general. Perhaps, remember, maybe discrimination is not a normative kind, in which case we can just characterize different kinds of discrimination or different cases, and that's it. Perhaps there's not much more to say in general, and perhaps it's okay that there isn't much more to say in general. Indeed, perhaps for most cases, we can work out some kind of a combination of some of the features that we already described, and perhaps this will get at least most cases, or most politically important cases, right. Maybe if we combine something about irrationality and disadvantage. So the typical case of discrimination amounts to an irrational disadvantage. And that already gets us most of the cases right. So perhaps for practical matters, this will be enough, at least most of the time. Of course, we can still ask about policy considerations regarding the desired scope of anti-discrimination law, but this is a different matter. Okay, so this has been rather long discussion of discrimination. I'm not really going to offer a conclusion. Instead, I'm going to want to highlight a central topic, certainly legally, but also in the philosophy of discrimination in general, and to show how it's related to at least one really major, very central, somewhat more abstract topic in moral philosophy. So think about the university example again. But now let's distinguish between two cases in which women are not promoted as quickly and as often as men are. In the first case, there was literally an old boys club. And they sat and decided, how can we prevent women from being promoted more often in the university? And so they came up with rules that they thought were going to make it the case that women were unlikely to be promoted. That's the first case. The second case is the case I mentioned earlier. So perhaps people sat down and thought, what would be the rules that best reflect, say, academic quality and research potential? They had absolutely no bad intentions, and in particular no bad intentions vis-a-vis gender. But the rules that they choose, as a matter of fact, do disadvantage many women and make it the case that women are promoted less often, less frequently. These are sometimes called, in the American legal context at least, cases of disparate treatment versus cases of disparate impact. So the Old Boys Club case is a case of disparate treatment, and the somewhat more subtle case, perhaps, is merely a case of disparate impact. So no one wanted to treat women differently, but the policies and rules that were put in place did in fact have a different impact on women compared to men. This is an interesting distinction because there are many things we want to say about it. You may think, for instance, that both are wrong. I do think that both are wrong. But you may still want to wonder whether both are equally seriously wrong. And here I want to say that I'm not so sure at all. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the Old Boys Club example is much worse, much more seriously wrong than the case of merely disparate impact. And this, even though it may be the case that in terms of the direct effect on women in academia, there is no big difference between the two. Perhaps somewhat more delicately and more importantly, it's not just a question of how seriously the wrong is. You may think that while the disparate impact case is also wrong, it's wrong in a different way. You may ask whether they are discriminatory, whether the disparate impact cases are discriminatory, but as I already said, at least philosophically, the word does not matter. What does matter is whether they're wrong, how seriously wrong they are, and whether they're wrong in the same way as the cases of disparate treatment. Of course, practically speaking, often, very often, disparate impact may serve as evidence for disparate treatment. See, one of the first things about how you run an Old Boys Club meeting is that you don't keep a paper trail, right? There are always going to be evidential problems. And perhaps the main piece of evidence that there was unequal, disparate treatment is just going to be in terms of disparate impact. So practically speaking, this may sort of at least to an extent, render the difference between the two less important. Because even if all you see is disparate impact, this may be good evidence for disparate treatment. But theoretically, that's not good enough. We can ask about these cases abstracting away from problems of evidence. Also, you may think that there are good policy considerations not to distinguish between them. Perhaps you know, for instance, that you're only going to create the right incentives for universities to offer substantively equal promotion opportunities for men and women if you treat disparate impact cases as if they were disparate treatment cases. If that's true, that's a complicated thing to determine, but if that's true, that amounts to a good policy consideration in favor of treating disparate impact cases as if they were, or similarly to, disparate treatment cases. But again, that's not the same as saying that they are equally wrong and equally wrong in the same kind of way. So theoretically speaking, what exactly is the difference? What exactly is the difference between these two kinds of cases? And at least in the way that I set out the cases, it seems like the main difference is in terms of the reasons for actions that are relevant in both cases. So in the old boys club example, the reason for putting the relevant rules in place was precisely to disadvantage women compared to men, or to make women less likely to be promoted. So the intention was discriminatory. The reason for action was discriminatory. Not just the action itself, certainly not just the consequences or impact of the action, but the reasons for action, the intentions underlying it. In the second case I described, the intentions were entirely legitimate in terms of academic quality. It's just that the impact was illegitimate and perhaps even discriminatory. So the distinction, which seems to be normatively significant, even if not necessarily significant for policy considerations, is the distinction between different intentions or different reasons for the similar action. And this brings us to a really general question in moral philosophy. The bigger question here is, do intentions ever matter for the moral permissibility or impermissibility or the seriousness of the impermissibility of a relevant action? Are intentions ever relevant in that kind of way? So as I said, this is a very general, very big topic to discuss, and we can't do it justice here. Notice that it arises in full generality. It's not about discrimination. It's about whether intentions and indeed mental states matter at all for the permissibility of relevant actions. One kind of consideration that's often made in this case is just intuitive examples where intentions do seem to matter. One typical kind of case here is the case that's discussed in the context of what's called as the doctrine of double effect. So for instance, as a part of a justified war effort, it may be morally permissible to bomb, say, a munition plant, even if you know that there's going to be collateral damage, that is, that some civilians in the neighborhood are going to be hurt. So long, that is, as your target is the munition plant, so you don't intend the harm to the civilians, you merely foresee it. But if, and trying to hold all other things equal, you can gain the same kind of strategic or tactical advantage by bombing those civilians directly themselves, that, according to most accounts, both of the morality of war and of international humanitarian law, that is impermissible. What explains the distinction? The civilians are going to be hurt either way. And then typically people say what explains the distinction is that in the first case you don't intend that they be harmed, and in the second case you do. That distinction is in terms of intentions, in terms of the mental states of the relevant agent. And if you do accept that kind of account of a moral distinction between the two cases, you seem to be committed to the thought that intentions matter to permissibility. Discrimination cases offer another kind of example. If you think that there is an important moral difference between the two university cases I highlighted, that seems to say that intentions matter. On the other hand, there seem to be rather convincing theoretical considerations pulling in the opposite direction, in the direction of denying any significance for intentions. It seems like if an agent is deliberating about what to do, say, you are now deliberating about whether it's okay to bomb that area. It seems what you should look to, as it were, is outward. You should ask, well, what will happen in the world to these people and to those people if I do, and if I don't drop the bombs? You shouldn't look inwards, trying to determine which intention you will be doing it with. But if intention matters to permissibility, then it seems like that is what you should do. That's one of the factors that determines permissibility. So if you agree with me that a deliberating agent should look outwards, that is strong reason to believe that intentions do not in fact matter, at least not directly and intrinsically, for permissibility. So there's a lot more to say. Perhaps we should go for a kind of a compromise position. Perhaps intentions often do not matter for permissibility, sometimes still do, and then of course we need an account of when they do, when they don't, and why. And much more needs to be said here. The important point here, though, is that what this nicely shows, I think, is how legal questions, in this case, legal questions specifically about discrimination and anti-discrimination law, how they may be closely related to a wider and some of the most abstract discussions in moral philosophy. For instance, the one about whether intentions matter to permissibility. And if this is so, perhaps once again, it will not be too optimistic to think that lessons may be learned here in both directions. So if we have a good account generally in moral philosophy about the relevance of intentions, we may apply it here to discussions of anti-discrimination law. But also, if anti-discrimination law and discussions thereof give us a good reason to think that, say, intentions do matter, perhaps that's a conclusion worth taking back into the most general discussion in moral philosophy.